to ASEAN People Speak, Season 3. I'm Regine Jessica Abuel, your host for this podcast. For our third episode, we will be joined by a distinguished expert in political security affairs, focusing on impacts of technology in Southeast Asia. She will share with us her knowledge of the potential implications of advanced technology on peace, security, and equality. She is a senior fellow in the Asia program at Carnegie, where she focuses on developments in Southeast Asia, particularly the impact and implications of technology in reshaping power dynamics, governance, and nation building in the region. Previously, she was Director of Political Security Affairs and Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C. office at the Asia Society Policy Institute. She spent most of her career at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies Malaysia, where she last held the position of Director, Foreign Policy and Security Studies. Between 2017 and 2019, she was a member of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. And now she is currently serving on the ICRC's Global Advisory Board on Digital Threats during conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, everyone, let us welcome Miss Elina Noor. Hello, Elina.
Hi, Regine. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for your time, and we're so glad that you can join us for the third episode of ASEAN People Speak this season 3. We are so excited to have you with us, and we cannot wait to hear your insights about peace and security in the age of advanced technology. May we just know where you are right now? How are you there?
I'm good. I'm speaking to you from the living room of my apartment in Washington, D.C. So as of the time of recording, it's getting late at night, but always a pleasure to speak to fellow colleagues from the region.
Yes. Oh, that's very nice. So, currently where I'm in Manila, it's actually morning. So this is actually very interesting too on our part because somehow we usually have guests who are in the same region or time zone, but we're also very excited to have you with us because you're all the way from the United States now, and I hope everything is going well and the weather is fine.
The weather is actually like Southeast Asia's weather, and my wish is that it'll stay this way, but that, winter is coming, as they say.
Oh, okay. Then you better prepare for winter then. Okay, so I guess we could start off our episode by asking you, why do we have to digitalize? And what is the importance of digitalization in, particularly Southeast Asia?
That's a brilliant question to start with, Regine, because there's so much excitement in Southeast Asia about everything digital. If you ask the regular consumer, you ask the younger generation, you ask even the older generation, not to mention governments, there is so much bullishness about any data-driven technology. Everybody has a smartphone, almost everybody. Granted, there's still a significant digital divide in the region, as well as in countries in the region. But by and large, there's great optimism about what digital technologies will bring for the economy and for the people of Southeast Asia. But your question of why we should digitalize, why we should optimize efficiency through digitalization is a really important one that I think we should reflect on a little more thoughtfully. Because if we're talking about digitalization to enable enhanced education, to create better opportunities for healthcare, for financial inclusion, these are all really admirable goals to have, and it's something that we should drive towards through digital technology. But if the aim is to enable more people to buy and sell goods on e-commerce platforms, for example, and e-commerce is growing in Southeast Asia,
Yes,
particularly,
indeed.
right? Particularly over COVID, when we were all locked down in our homes.
Yes, there were a lot of applications and developments in terms of digitalizing, not just, from the simplest things to the more complex ones. Before it was just shopping online, but now everything is digital.
Everything. We order food through apps.
Exactly.
And we need to consider when we're doing all this, when we're buying goods, when we're buying, clothes or toys or gadgets, even ordering food, we need to consider that against the larger backdrop of the climate crisis. Okay, we can no
Mhm.
longer think of things business as usual without considering the environment. And all our transactions online have a cost, not just financial
Mm.
cost, but they have an environmental cost, right? From the production, from the manufacture of a device, in order to create those digital opportunities for transactions, to the data centers that consume huge amounts of energy that are storing our data, to kind of the gig workers and what the costs are to them, the labor costs, to the end life cycle of digital tools. How are we getting rid of e-waste? We should be thinking about all these different costs, just as we're thinking about the benefits that we're reaping through digital technologies. And I don't think we do that enough, unfortunately, in Southeast Asia.
You mentioned about this. It's very interesting that you mentioned a while ago that we should optimize digitalization to enable and enhance education or to better opportunities for healthcare. So I think that's a very noble goal, but at the same time, do you think at this point the Southeast Asian region is moving towards that? Because you've mentioned a while ago, most of digitalization focuses on online transactions or more likely e-commerce, and you've actually mentioned also about e-waste. So how do you think this could go well together, or how can we move towards that optimization of digitalization that you were talking about?
I think we just have to be more mindful about these externalities, right? Conventional economic theory teaches us that things like environmental costs are externalities. And maybe
Mm.
we should rethink this idea that they are externalities, but actually factor them in to some of the ledgers regarding digital technologies, right? And I just want to bring up a minor example because I think it's really important to keep in mind the historical trajectory of digital use of technologies.
Mhm.
When submarine cables were first laid around the world in the 1800s or 1900s, I think it's the late 1800s, a long time ago, basically, right? The submarine cables that lay the basis for the transfer of data that we now enjoy today was actually at the great cost of one of the rubber species in Indonesia and Malaysia, to the point
Mm.
that this particular species was driven to temporary extinction because that rubber was used to insulate the cables for those
Mm.
submarine cables that were being laid across the world. And so all these things have a cost that we need to keep in mind. It happened in the past, it could happen again with different sorts of resources. And Southeast Asia is rich in natural resources. So when we
Yes.
talk about kind of our right to peace and security, we need to be thinking about it more comprehensively rather than just through narrow security and military lens.
That's a very good insight that you've mentioned. And a nice example also that you shared with us about submarine cables. I want to explore or ask you or expound more on being more mindful of the externalities of digitalization. And in line with that, I guess I also just want to ask, you've mentioned about e-waste a while ago. What are the risks then that come with the rise of artificial intelligence, especially concerning our right to security?
Yeah, so a number of things there, right? I think with e-waste, we need to be thinking about what kinds of devices we're using and where they're going to end up later on, because there is such a thing with our smartphones, for example, such
Yes.
such a thing as planned obsolescence, right? So you get a
Mm.
brand new smartphone and then you enjoy it at max potential for like the first 2 years. And then you notice it starting to slow down a little, and all that has been planned because the idea is to get you to buy another phone
Another
and
one.
another phone, right?
Yes.
Every
Mm-hmm.
few years, you're upgrading your device. And this benefits companies, of course, but have you ever wondered where all these phones go to?
I
And
don't know, actually. So maybe you could give us an insight where. But
so,
that's a
in
very
theory,
interesting. That's a very interesting point that you've mentioned, because especially with the youth nowadays, or people who want to be those who would want to have the latest gadgets, that would probably be just the lifespan. And then where would that go after?
Right. So, in theory, some of those components are recycled, or the older devices are passed on to quote unquote developing world countries, to populations that might not, they are deemed not to need the most up to date, the most modern and sophisticated technology, which itself tells
Mm,
you something about the mindset of certain
yes.
people, right? And there's a bit of a condescension there that I don't think we should be encouraging at all. But the reality is that a lot of e-waste actually leaches out very dangerous and unhealthy chemicals through landfills that
Mm.
and permeates through our waterways as well into our oceans. And then the actual devices themselves may or may not be turned into something useful. But given that the figure thrown about is 90% of plastic is not recycled at all, regardless of what we think is going on, I
Mhm.
think we need to be thinking about what all this e-waste is really doing to our environment.
Yes, indeed. I'd like to pick up from that where you've mentioned that, we don't know exactly where they are being disposed, but then it also gives an impact also between like developing and those who are developed countries, and how it also kind of shifts there's like a digital divide
Yes.
wherein the technology also, one country gets like the most advanced or the latest ones, but the others are being left behind. The developing countries are being left behind because they're the ones who receive those not obsolete but not too latest ones, and that gives an overall impact in the developing country. Now, you've actually also mentioned about the environment.
Right.
You told us a while ago that there is an impact in landfills, in waste, since we're talking about gadgets and certain chemicals,
Yeah.
materials. Where do these things go after being used?
Yeah.
And most likely, they don't get dumped or they don't get processed in the developing countries. Sometimes, I mean, sorry, in the developed countries. Sometimes they are being transported in developing countries where all the processes um, are being done or are being yes, and then eventually the developing country suffers.
Yeah.
So
So
in a way they are in the losing end.
yeah, and Regina, I want to bring you back to the beginning of the life cycle of these devices, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
smartphones or systems and machines that process data for artificial intelligence learning purposes. And this gets to the point, the topic of our discussion, which is peace and security. Now, a lot of these devices rely on particular minerals, right? And the Philippines is rich in lithium and nickel, right? And a lot of these components go towards not just manufacturing chips in our phones, but also increasingly are in demand for electronic vehicles and the batteries that power these EVs. And so we have to think about the fact that our countries in the region are rich in these resources. Are we going to return to the extractive nature of economic
Yes.
activity that we had to go through in the past, right after we gained our independence, in order to be part of the global economy? And that's how we grew our economies.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do we want to repeat that cycle, even if the end goal, as we're told, is for a cleaner, greener environment, right? EVs are supposed to replace fossil fuel
Fossil
powered
fuels, yes.
vehicles, right? But the process of
Extracting,
extracting, right,
yes,
right,
exactly.
yeah, and adding value to these minerals is actually really dirty with leaching of pollutants, and it directly impacts the right to security, the right to a livelihood, and the right to just exist in peace for many of these communities. And we see it everywhere now, wherever these materials and minerals are found in different Southeast Asian countries.
Yes, and that's a very nice point that you've also mentioned. And now we're not just talking about just the simple phone being produced, but we're also talking about the impacts in human security and the environment and on the people themselves. I mean, how people, the communities are affected. It's funny because you've mentioned a while ago that EV or electronic vehicles are
Yes.
produced to reduce carbon or fossil fuels. But then the effect of it on the communities where lithium or some chemicals or elements are extracted are also getting affected. So in a way, it is ironic
Yes.
that it's not really helping 100 I mean, it's not helping the environment 100%.
Right.
It actually has an impact on the community or the people involved in the process.
Yep.
So, and I think it touches upon exploitation of developing countries for the advancement of technology. And I guess on that note, I want to ask you, aside from the things that you have mentioned, what do you think are still some ways wherein artificial intelligence, from everyday digital tools to military technologies, contribute significantly to the pursuit of peace? I mean, we've mentioned a while ago how the cycle is ironic, but how does this then contribute, or how does this impact in a country's pursuit of peace and
Yeah.
stability?
I think this gets back to the original question of why we optimize and how we need to think more carefully about the impact of digital technologies, not only on our environment, but people, right? ASEAN is supposed to be people centered and people oriented. And we hear this over and over again. But the discussions around data driven technologies in Southeast Asia, I feel, are too siloed and too focused on
Mm.
just growing the economy
E-commerce,
without
yeah.
and in ASEAN we have this concept of comprehensive security, which you yourself, Regine, brought up, and we need to be thinking of digital technologies in that light. So we've talked quite a bit about the environment. We haven't touched on, maybe we can discuss this in a later podcast or so, but we haven't touched on kind of the knowledge perspectives that drive the ethics of artificial intelligence. And this directly gets to, again, the point about security and just the right to be able to live in peace in Southeast Asia.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking in particular about the indigenous communities of Southeast Asia that have long been marginalized, that may or may not want to be a part of the digital world, but are somehow compelled to. And of course, there are benefits to be gained from
Yeah.
digitalization, right?
Mhm.
But the way that indigenous communities interact with the environment is so different from how people like me, who are not indigenous, interact with the environment. And there's a
Mm.
whole knowledge perspective and worldview and framing of how we should be thinking about AI that we need to be learning about. So, for example, in Africa, there are scholars who talk about the relational aspect of artificial intelligence, not just the
Mhm.
rational aspect, right? Because when we think about technology, we think about ones and zeros, we think about binary codes, things like that. We don't talk about how technology is essentially a societal tool, and that we need to think of it in terms of how we relate to each other, how we relate to technology, how technology serves us if we're going to be a truly people centered community.
The things that you've mentioned a while ago are really very enlightening, because now you've talked about the relational aspect of AI and technology and how this really impacts. Well, we've talked about the human security elements, but you've mentioned a while ago the ethics that we are supposed to be aware of actually as well, which is the ethics of artificial intelligence and how this affects peace in ASEAN, peace in the communities, peace in marginalized sectors. And you've mentioned indigenous peoples, and it is indeed a good thing that we change or modernize things, but at the same time we also should recognize that um, indigenous peoples also have their way of life, their way of living and connecting with the environment, which also should be respected as well.
Right.
So thank you very much for that. Well, I guess I will be boiling down to my last part or last question. You've mentioned a while ago that we all should be aware, and you've talked about a little bit about ethics. Now, in what way then? I mean, we're not going to talk about the different state organs. We want to talk about now, I guess, civil society. So, how can civil society organizations effectively counter this misuse or this imbalance in the use of artificial intelligence as a weapon or as something that is used primarily on e-commerce instead of optimizing it into better goals like healthcare or education? And what steps do you think can governments, or now I want to focus more on the private sector on our
Right.
part, what can we take or do to boost public trust in artificial intelligence advancements?
Yeah, all those elements of governance that you mentioned, the private sector, government, civil society, we're all in the same ecosystem, right? And governments may make policies, but it's the private sector that holds the majority of the technological infrastructure in many countries. And there has to be this partnership, but as well as a check and balance against what's going on. And I think this is where the role of civil society becomes critical. The need to raise awareness amongst the general population on some of the issues that we discussed, but more the need to demand accountability for some of the mechanisms and processes that private sector companies have put in place ostensibly for good. We need to be demanding, for example, greater transparency and environmental impact assessments and social impact assessments whenever a data center is located or situated somewhere, for example. We need to also be mindful that some of these technologies, and we haven't gone into kind of the pure hard defense side of
Yeah.
AI, for example, right? But we also need to be thinking about how this may affect us in case something breaks out in the South China Sea or elsewhere. And there are all sorts of operations that are going on in cyberspace that we also need to be aware of that can be exacerbated or mitigated through artificial intelligence. We've seen how, for example, AI has exacerbated the situation in Myanmar with fake news.
Yes, exactly. Sorry, but I was going to segue that as well.
Okay,
Misinformation or
right,
disinformation. I think that's something that has to be, that's a different battle, but
right.
it's a completely different battle that, civil society organizations or even us ourselves are battling with. But you've mentioned something regarding transparency and social impact assessments
Mhm.
and demanding accountability from our government and what happens when it comes to these things. And maybe can we ask you to elaborate more on that?
Yeah, for example, so I mentioned data centers, right? And data centers are supposedly becoming more green. And so the idea is that they will use less energy and not divert as much energy, for example, to power these data centers because they're very energy intensive in order to maintain that data, to process and store that data. Now, there are different modifications that are being made to buildings, for example, that house these data centers that make them more green. But we need to demand greater transparency in the information, and we need to figure out like what the measurements are being used, what the metrics are being used, and how that really squares against the environmental changes that are happening. It's not just what happens in one particular location. It also matters what's going on in the backdrop of this greater climate
Yes.
crisis, right? And also social displacement if that happens in order to situate a particular data center. That's just data centers, right? There
Yeah.
are all the other components in the whole life cycle of AI that we need to be aware of.
Wow. You indeed gave us a lot of insights and very, very nice talking points regarding AI and peace and security. And well, I guess on that note, I just want to ask you if you have any more last words or anything that you would want our audience to remember as we are about to close this episode.
I just want to emphasize the fact that, remember, technology is a societal tool, and we need to demystify technology in a way that we can ask the right questions. Why digitalize? Why optimize? How will technology serve us instead of making us serve others? And so I just want people out there to be aware of these questions, to think of technology more critically, particularly as it relates to our region, that's supposedly an people-oriented and people-centered one.
Wow, thank you very much for that. And that's a very, very beautiful way to wrap up our conversation in this third episode of ASEAN People Speak. That's all for today, guys. And we are very much happy to have Elina with us. Thank you all for listening. And thank you, Elina, for joining us today. Would you want to promote your social media account or website or your organization, publications, or any upcoming projects at this point?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Elina Noor, or on X. I'm not very active on X, but LinkedIn is where I post my updates, and I will be publishing a little bit more about some of the issues that we've talked about in the coming months. So stay tuned. And thank you so much,
Yes.
Regine.
Thank you so much too. And we will look forward to the things that you will be publishing because this topic is really very interesting. Thank you so much for giving us that aspect of artificial intelligence, not just a tool for e-commerce, but something that we should optimize so that it would be as noble as it may sound, but it would be for society's future.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Elina. Join us again next time. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button on Spotify to stay updated and never miss an episode. You can also stay connected with us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by following at WG ASEAN HRMEC and visit our website at ASEANHRMEC.org. Again, thank you so much, guys, for staying. And until next time, stay informed and stay engaged. Goodbye.